Thank you, Diane. Can you hear me and see the slides?
We can. Do you want to test your cursor?
It never works, so
okay.
I'm not going to worry about it.
We cannot see it.
I'll use okay. Great. Thank you. A big shout out to the organizers for organizing the conference, which I'm just really enjoying, and it's great to be able to do this online. So the title of my talk is far too long. Let me just reduce it. I mean, I made it up, it's my fault, but let me just reduce it and say what this talk will be about is looking at how we can go from chemical abundances of stars in large surveys to understanding the architecture of a galaxy. And a lot of the work that I'll be showing in this talk has been led by PhD students, Lucy Liu, Adam Wheeler, Raina Ramparli, and Bridget Ratcliffe. Okay, so we're in this new measurements regime. In astronomy, we have all of these stellar ages and precision abundances and distance to our stars, and we're inferring orbits. And we can start to really answer questions, the big questions about galaxy formation, like how many stars were born in the Milky Way, and when were they born? From what material were they born, and on what orbits are they currently residing? To know on what material stars were born on, we need to measure their chemical compositions. And to know when they were born, we measure stellar ages. Now, one of the beautiful changes in the last few years is we now have consistent and precise element abundances and ages for really large numbers of stars. And as an artifact of galactic, and as an artifact of radial migration, and my, I think my host duties are giving me interesting privileges that I'm clicking on. As a beautiful artifact of radial migration, one can have a volume limited survey around the sun and be basically tapping into the star formation environment across the entire, or across a really large expanse of the Milky Way. So I think that's a beautiful thing to remember for a survey like Galar. We're looking at the star formation history across a really large radial expanse by observing these stars in the disk. So I think a lot about data in my talk is going to be, although it's nominally about chemodynamics, it's really pivoted in how I'm thinking about the data and a lot of the questions I've had with respect to how we should proceed in chemodynamical analyses. So I want to start with how and why do I think about these data? So I think a lot about spectra and the sorts of measurements we can derive from these spectra and how these measurements are correlated. So stars and spectra, they're my tools for linking the chemical enrichment history of a galaxy to its architecture. Spectra is my go-to when I want to answer this big picture question of why does the Milky Way look like it does? We have these really large numbers of stellar spectra, and that's been driving a new analysis landscape, and we're on Sky, there's no stopping us, we're obtaining more data with all of these new surveys. Now, I think to my mind, interpretability is really important in the context of astrophysics, and I'm really interested in building models of data, but I deliberately want those to be quite simple models. In addition to that, my goal is to ask very simple questions of the data. So I'm very deliberate in that I want to query the data in the most simple way that I can think of. So chemical abundances to galaxy architecture, where the big picture question is how do galaxies like the Milky Way come to look the way that they do? And we have measurements of chemical abundances, orbits, and ages to start to look at answering this question. So I'm going to break down my talk into two simple questions, and these are things that I've been trying to work out for myself over the last years. The first is dimensionality. What variables should I work with to do chemodynamics work? And that has brought me to the second question, which is how do we best find abundance outliers in neighborhoods? And specifically, I mean evolutionary neighborhoods, not spatial neighborhoods. And the first part of my talk, looking at dimensionality, will really be looking at stars of the disk. And when I'm talking about abundance outliers, I think some of the methods that we've developed are very good to turn towards the galactic halo. Okay, so dimensionality and what variables to work with for chemodynamics. So the most interpretable form of this question, to my mind, is to ask at fixed metallicity, Fe, how do abundances, X, vary over time? And a lot of people have looked at this. And we know that each element has an age abundance relation. Okay, and this shows an example from a paper of mine from a couple of years ago, looking at those age abundance relations for a couple of different elements at two different metallicity pivot points. So at a metallicity of solar and minus 0.35, we have the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, sodium, magnesium, aluminium, and silicon age abundance relations, age on the x-axis, abundance on the y-axis, And you can see that each element has its own relation, and that relation changes with metallicity. So not only does each element have its own age abundance relation, but the scatter around that relation is pretty small. Okay, and that relation changes not only over metallicity, but it changes over the magnesium or the alpha enhancement of the stars. Okay, so if we pivot at different points in magnesium and different metallicities, the elements, at least a subset of them, change in their gradients in these age abundance relations. So all of this has been beautifully leveraged as chemical clocks. And of course, these place very strong constraints on stellar nucleosynthesis and star formation. I mean, this is what nucleosynthesis and chemical evolution is, the change in element abundances for populations over time. So age, iron, magnesium, these are key variables. And what we think we're getting to with these is birth radius. Okay, so we know that for a lot of the disk, age, iron, and magnesium alone predict the other abundances to high precision. So these three variables are almost all we need to know to infer the birth radius of stars. So a natural question, given this, is how precisely, or conversely imprecisely, should we expect to be able to go from these three variables to birth radius? And we can look at that from the perspective of the data, and we can also look at that from simulations. And this just shows a little look into that, looking at a simulation from Tobias Buck. He'll be talking in a couple of days, looking at how well we can infer birth radius of stars, given three numbers, their iron, the magnesium, and their age, using a simple model, a polynomial regression, where we've used some subset of stars in the simulation to learn the relationship between these three variables and their birth radius, and use that model to determine the birth radius for another set of stars. The x-axis shows their true birth radius, the y-axis our inference, and we find that we can infer birth radius to a precision of around 1 kiloparsec in this simulation. Okay, so age, iron, magnesium give us birth radius we expect to some precision. So what are the consequences for this idea of going from chemical abundances to galactic architecture? Well, age, iron, and magnesium contain most of the information unless we measure other elements to a precision of around 0.02 dex. So we're very well motivated to work in reference frames of iron, magnesium, and age, and understand spatial and orbital properties. Okay, so at this point, I'm just playing catch up. The iron and magnesium plane is a striking summary of chemical evolution over time. It's well studied, and it's been used as a reference frame for understanding our galaxy for years. Okay, there's heaps of references. This is a very incomplete list that I can put that have leveraged this plane to understand our galaxy. But we now have quantified that it captures a vast amount of the information that we have about the chemical makeup of our disk. Okay, the iron plane broadly traces supernova 1a, magnesium broadly supernova type 2. And when we now color this plane by ages, we can see that old stars live at the top and young stars live down the bottom, and there are these beautiful gradients, both vertically and horizontally. Now, because we have so many stars, we can start to very deliberately go from seeing this as a striking summary of chemical evolution over time to being able to work for us as a supernovae reference plane over time and ask questions in that reference frame. So with 10,000, 100,000, a million stars, we're really able to look at chemical evolution at a higher resolution and look at the link and the correlations between those chemical properties and the architecture of stars across the Milky Way. So what I'm going to do is just throw down a grid across this chemical plane, and I'll call each of these little points in this grid a chemical cell. And I just want to query the data to say, what is the link between my chemical plane and my structural plane? You might ask, what is the distribution of the radius, the height from the plane, the orbits of stars within and between these chemical cells? And I'll show an example of looking at these chemical cells and exploring the radius and the height from the plane of stars across each of these cells. And this is related to the monoabundance analysis of Bovie, looking at scale heights and scale lengths, but we now have ages and are just making simple queries of the data between and within these chemical cells as to what the correlation structure is as a function of age. Okay, so chemical abundances, galactic architecture, chemical cells. The figure at left shows the grid. The figure at right is the exact same plane of iron versus magnesium, but now within each of these cells, we're showing the radial distribution of stars and their height from the plane. This is the apogee survey, so stars go from about 5 to 15 kiloparsec and plus or minus 4 kiloparsec within each cell. So someone pointed out to me, this is essentially the inverse of the Hayden plot. This is essentially pivoting at different points in the supernovae plane, and then asking what the spatial distribution of stars is. And you have this beautiful, clear correlation structure between age and spatial distributions and gradients across this plane. So there's a lot of things we could talk about, but let me just summarize by saying the inner region is extended and old, and stars that are magnesium rich up the top, that represents the inner region of the galaxy. It's extended and old, and stars that are more metal rich and magnesium poor is tracing the disk, which is flattened and young. Okay, so this is a reprojection of things that we know, but now we're seeing this beautiful ensemble-like population. And we think what we're seeing and what we're able to tap into is inside out and upside down galactic formation across the Milky Way. So what's inside out and upside down formation? Let me just spend a couple of minutes going through this. So inside out is the radial growth of the disk over time. Stars form in the inner region, and then over time grow across the galactic disk so that we find our older stars in the inner galaxy, our younger stars in the outer galaxy. And we can see this from the apogee survey. If we color the radius, galactic height from the plane, we color the apogee selection by the age of stars, you can see that there's this beautiful age gradient. Older stars live in the outer region, older stars live in the inner region, younger stars live in the outer region, and you have this beautiful flaring, which is thought to be due to radial migration. So my cursor doesn't work, so I'm going to put some lines on to guide your eye. If I just go plus or minus 1 kiloparsec above the plane, my galactic radius is going from about -5 kiloparsec, which is beyond the center of the galaxy, to 20 kiloparsec, which is the outer disk. Put a couple of markers in either side of the sun, 4 to 12 kiloparsec. You can see that, you can basically see this age gradient of old to young stars quite clearly. Now, what about upside down formation? This is the vertical process in the galaxy, and this is a little bit harder because there's basically two processes going on we have to consider: upside down formation and heating. And this is summarized in this figure from a really nice paper from John Bird that came out a little bit earlier on this year. The x-axis is showing the look-back time of stars, the y-axis, the vertical velocity dispersion, and what's being shown is mono-age populations, older to younger populations as you go down on the figure. Okay, so the simulation is representing both heating and upside down formation. There's this gas reservoir that's cruising along look-back time, and you have stars being born, heating over time to the point that we would observe them today, and older stars are born with higher vertical velocity dispersions and younger stars with lower vertical velocity dispersions. So we have the expectation in galaxy formation, both of these processes are at play, and it's non-trivial to differentiate them. We can start to look at simulations and compare our simulations to our data, however. We have a simulation where we know that a galactic disk settles in inside out, upside down formation, and we see that that's qualitatively similar to our data. So we look at our observational plane going from our chemical plane to our structural plane, and we can compare that to a simulation from Tobias Buck, the same simulation that I mentioned before. This is a hydrodynamic cosmological simulation. This has been sampled in the same way that the data has been observed, and we can see that qualitatively we reproduce these trends, okay, across the supernovae plane where the stars are formed first quickly in the inner region, extended vertically, and where they're formed later, more slowly, further out in the disk, and more of a flat distribution. But the data plane, what if we just embed ourselves in the data plane? How can we query the data in different ways to think about this problem? So what if we look at the architecture between and within cells? Okay, so what I'm going to show you now is the histograms of the height from the plane for young and old stars in each cell. So within each cell, I'm going to look at stars less than 5 gigayears, stars greater than 10 gigayears, and just show a histogram of their height from the plane, the distribution of their heights from the plane. This is what this looks like. There's a lot going on. Blue represents the young bin, red represents the older bin. Okay, there's lots of things going on in this figure. This is heating, upside down formation, radial migration, there's age errors, this is blurring everything out. But let me just bring your attention to a couple of points about this figure. Okay, within cells, we see a very weak age dependence. This is not true in every cell, okay, and that's an important point. But in many cells, we see that the distribution of Z height from the plane is very similar for young and old stars. Okay, between cells, we see this extremely strong correlation. between their chemistry, magnesium and iron, and their distribution in Z. Okay, I'll just show you a couple of different points on this plane. So much wider distribution in one part of the chemistry, much narrower distribution in another part. So what we're seeing is that the architecture is so strongly driven by a star's location within this plane. Okay, and this must place really strong constraints on the assembly process of the galaxy, and whether we go forward with modeling this, comparing to simulations, I think this is a critical way that we can try and understand the role of inside-out formation and upside-down formation versus heating. Good.
Melissa, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, very good. I'm more than halfway there. So the first, I'm raising more questions than I'm answering, but this is, and one of the reasons I'm doing this is because we have all of this Galar data that we can also turn to this problem. So I've demonstrated that the supernovae reference plane over time is one potential avenue to learn about the architecture of the Milky Way and what has set this. The second part of my questioning of this data is how can we use this plane to learn about star formation in the context of what we understand about dimensionality, given the age abundance relations. The way that I frame this question, and we're going to hear, I think, a lot more on this from Yuan Sen in a couple of days. I've just looked at this from a very simple perspective. How well do abundances predict one another, specifically in the Milky Way's disk? The simple question that I'm asking of the data is how well can we predict elements from supernovae from two fiducial elements? So how well can we predict a bunch of elements formed from supernovae from two elements that we know are formed from supernovae, our iron and our magnesium? I'm going to use simple linear regression. I'm going to take a set of objects to create a model to learn the relationship between evolutionary state, iron and magnesium, and my set of 5 elements. And I'm going to take different stars that haven't seen the model, deploy my model on those stars and see how well I can predict those 5 elements. And this is what we find. There's a few thousand, 50,000 red giant stars from apogee. On the x-axis is their measured abundance from ASCAP, and on the y-axis is the inferred abundance, what you could get if you only had temperature, gravity, iron, magnesium. So predicted. So the residual prediction, how well we can predict these to about 0.25 dex on average for each element. And that's both surprising and not surprising. These elements are all created by supernovae, so they're all very correlated. We can predict them pretty well. But that also means an element's individuality is captured within that 0.025 dex. So I think that's a very important constraint, and there must be gold in those residuals. The residual variance is very small, so how might we tap into it? And this is very related to asking how might we find rare objects? And what can this tell us about the physics of stellar evolution and perturbations? Okay, thinking about this residual variance is very related to how might we find the craziest objects with strange abundances, to my mind, in the Milky Way. Okay, and this raises the question of outliers, things that don't behave like the rest of the data. So with the last couple of minutes of the talk, I'll introduce this unsupervised method for identifying X-enriched stars directly from stellar spectra. It uses the spectrum directly, so in that sense, it's unsupervised. There'll be another talk a little bit later today doing something similarly. So it doesn't require stellar labels, but instead it directly predicts for any star, any line region using a linear model of the neighborhood. So it's a very simple approach. You basically, this has been developed on the Lamos spectra. You basically say for any star, if I want to know what that masked region is, that little region in pink, I can build a model of say 100 nearest neighbors stars in spectral space to use other regions of the spectra that aren't masked to predict that region for my star. I can then compare the data to my prediction and see if it's strange or not, comparing to its neighborhood. Okay, so this is called tangent space projection for arbitrary elements from blended lines. And we did this in Lamos to identify lithium, because that's what we saw earlier today, that people are really interested in lithium. It's a bit of a mystery. And we think we've identified stars that have come from planet accretion or non-standard mixing and youth in our sample. Okay, I'm going to run really fast over this. Do I have another minute, Diana, or am I out? 1 minute?
1 minute.
Good. So I'm going to run really fast over how this works because it's very simple. For every star you care about, you compare that to all other stars in your reference set, so all other stars in your survey, with its little region masked that you want to predict to find its k nearest neighbors. And that's one of the 2 hyperparameters you set in this procedure. You then make a so-called tangent space model using those k nearest neighbors by mapping it to its lower dimensional representation using a simple PCA. You take those first eigenvalues, which we call Q, that's our second hyperparameter that we set, and you can use them to create a model that you use to predict your mass region of spectra. And you ask, does my prediction compared to my data, do my residuals of my prediction compared to my data correspond to excess absorption? So this is an example of an outlier from Adam's work in the lithium region line. The K nearest neighbors are in gray. The prediction is in orange and blue. There's two different sets of hyperparameters used here. You can see in the K and the Q have two different values, so they make slightly different predictions. And the real data is in black. So you can see this screaming lithium-rich star in this data. Okay, these lithium-rich stars span across the entire temperature-gravity plane. There's a number in common with Galar. There's about 150 in common with Galar, or 75% of them have a lithium enhancement of greater than 1.5. And if we just take a selection of these stars and plot them in the temperature-gravity plane at right and just show the spectra at left, you can see, for example, young stars, 1 and 2. These have a screaming hydrogen alpha emission line, and they're lithium enriched, and we basically have 8,000 of these that we think are suitable candidates for a bunch of follow-on work. Where we're taking this work is to look at any wavelength region, any survey, any line that we think is a valuable systematic approach to outlier determination that we're particularly interested in applying to the stellar halo. Okay, so in conclusion, my big picture question that I did not answer is, how do galaxies like the Milky Way come to look the way they do? Chemical abundances, orbits and ages are what we have. Okay, what we have determined in getting to this question is that iron, magnesium, and age are a very sensible basis to examine other variables. They're a direct line to our birth, and we think we can use these to trace the upside down, inside out formation of the disk. Okay, we've seen from the age abundance relation, the dimensionality is low, and we can now turn that to chemical evolution and see how well do elements predict other elements. And we can move to outlier detection. If the dimensionality is low, what about the weird things? And I think one of the best ways to look for outliers is to go directly to the data, where we can look at basically measures of variance in evolutionary state, which would be very useful, I hope, for tagging of structures and tapping into physics. I'm sorry if I went over time, Diane, but I'm done.
Great. Thank you very much, Melissa. Do we have questions? Please feel free to use the raise hand reaction in Zoom, type in the chat, or if there are in-room questions, I suppose Jeffrey will let me know. Well, I'll ask a question in the meantime. So do you, I mean, this seems pretty powerful. So do you expect to be basically applicable to any spectroscopic survey in the future?
I hope so. That's the goal. So
Be very exciting.
Yeah.
And it doesn't depend on the resolution at all?
Which particular, the outlier detection?
Well, I guess, yeah, all of it. And I mean, I know that like Sloan 5 is sort of counting on, you know, getting lower signal to noise stars. And that was previously based on the Great Canyon results. And so I guess I was wondering if this method is now applicable to even like low resolution, low signal to noise spectra. Are you sort of thinking that these things could push what types of spectra can be really exploited?
That's definitely why I'm interested in working with the data directly. I think that gets you past other backlogs in the noise floor. So yeah, definitely being motivated with that in mind.
Great. Danny, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Great talk, Melissa, as always. Just a quick one. So do you find the residuals when you make the fits to be the same for the same types of elements which we think are formed in a similar way? Or do you find that these vary depending on the families?
Are you asking about the correlations in the residuals? Yes, essentially, I think Yuan Senting is going to answer that question much better tomorrow or the day after, but essentially, yes, things are correlated in an astrophysically sensible way, but I haven't done any sort of systematic analysis of it.
Great.